Today in the EU, Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosts his first European Political Community Summit. Today is the debut of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the international political scene as he hosts the European Political Community Summit, a meeting where 50 leaders from all over the world join to discuss a hot list of topics. What are the leaders discussing today? And will Keir Starmer succeed in steering the direction of UK-EU relations? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. To look ahead at the EPC Dance program, I am joined in the studio by Global Europe editor Alexandra Brzozowski. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Giada.
This week, we'll see the fourth meeting of the European political community. It is yet another European summit format. Can you walk us through the setup?
Indeed. So it looks like we're really heading towards the final summit before summer break. This EPC meeting will be the fourth since the grouping was founded in October 2022. And as we remember, it was the brainchild of French President Emmanuel Macron.
Comment organiser l'Europe? D'un point de vue politique.
The idea was initially that after Russia's war on Ukraine, the format would offer a stage for more informal talks between European countries, not only the EU, but also beyond in the neighborhood. And what we've seen in the past summits was rather underwhelming. I mean, in Spain, for example, we had a couple of countries boycotting it. It was Turkey and Azerbaijan, for example. So in this sense, the UK is kind of forced to get the summit right, to keep the EPC on track as a format.
And how many leaders will participate?
This time around, organizers expect around 50 European leaders that will be meeting at Blenheim Palace, a very Versailles-esque castle in the UK countryside, 2 hours out of London. And actually, the place has quite a bit of symbolism because it's the birthplace of Winston Churchill. And it was actually here where he wrote his blood, toils, tears, and sweat speech in 1940. So as the summit takes place at the time where Europe is really at the crossroads between gearing up towards a raw economy, struggle with the far right domestically, and also facing some uncertainty on the global stage with the US elections in November, that kind of gives an interesting setting, I think, for leaders also to consider.
And interestingly, this week's summit will be hosted by the newly elected Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Many see this as the UK's big comeback on the international stage, with the potential to mark a major reset for the country and its priorities. What can we expect from him?
So technically, it will be not his exact first encounter with some of the European leaders, at least. Last week in Washington at the NATO summit, some of them have already rubbed shoulders. And exactly there in Washington, we saw him use the sideline talks to show off a new image of Britain as a more stable country in contrast to what chaotic recent past we have seen under the previous governments.
And what's on top of Starmer's agenda?
So here again, at this summit in Blenheim Castle, it is expected that he will stress his government's foreign policy goals. One of the prime ones is resetting relations with the EU after years of Brexit, reclaiming the UK's role, and also tackling climate change and building ties with the global south. So this is what he will be expected to emphasize. And on the other hand, it's really, I think, a stage where he can show the difference towards the previous government.
Yes, and his predecessor, the Conservative Rishi Sunak, had said earlier this year that he was looking forward to discussing illegal migration, an issue dear to many EU leaders. The priorities have changed now with Starmer, so what can we expect for EU-UK relations moving onwards?
Actually, the summit comes at a very interesting time because really it comes a day after the UK's new Labour government promised yesterday to reset relations with Europe. So in the King's speech, where he read out the new government's programme.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government will govern in service to the country. My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
Improving UK trade ties and investment relationships with the EU was featuring very high on the agenda. So there might be actually positive tones we could see from EU leaders and interactions Starmer might have with them. There are also rumors presently that the UK and the EU are looking to hold their first ever bilateral summit in the coming months as part of Starmer's attempt to reset this relationship. It's normally something that the EU holds with third countries such as India and China, but so far hasn't done with the UK since Brexit. So it would be really a new step. And as far as we understand, that the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, is likely to discuss the idea with Starmer on the sideline of this meeting. So maybe we will see an announcement in this regard. On the other hand, there's also ongoing talks about an EU-UK security partnership would come as a part of a series that the EU is planning to sign with a row of third countries, but obviously with the UK, who was a member of the EU before, and where the security ties have been missing after Brexit, that would be also a step forward. This is maybe something that we will not see this summit, but I think that's the first opportunity to kind of map out what it could entail.
Back to the meeting agenda. What are the most pressing topics that leaders will discuss today?
So it's really a bit of an odd summit this time because I think compared to the previous ones where there were clear agenda points where they were related to a certain crisis, right? I mean, it was always Ukraine, but in some cases we had Belgrade Pristina, we had Armenia, Azerbaijan. This time, I think it's not as clear what the main features of the summit will be. Many of the European leaders in attendance have a heavy few months of summits and international engagements in their bag. So you can really feel that there seems to be somewhat a collective tiredness to have this another summit. But especially following the G7, the peace conference in Switzerland, the UCOS that we have seen earlier in the last 2 months, and the NATO summit now last week, I think the summit could present also a chance to reiterate support for Ukraine beyond what has already been said. I mean, especially before the summer break, there are some fears that the Russians might start pushing again along the front lines. So this would be really a crucial moment to just emphasize what has been already agreed, but also before November and the US elections, that's also one of the chances to maybe see how to further Trump-proof support. But Ukraine will be featuring high on the agenda because also Ukraine's President Zelensky is attending. What we could potentially maybe expect is that he also can sign a few more of those security arrangements that have been signed between Kiev and some of the Western countries.
And beyond Ukraine?
Other than that, there's some other topics on the agenda which are preset. So we know that they will be talking about energy and migration, illegal migration probably as well. But I think compared to what previous Prime Minister Sunak has been attempting to make the feature of the summit, it might be a bit more toned down from that side. And one other key issue, and I think that's maybe something that was not so much foreseen for the agenda, is hybrid threats. I mean, leaders will discuss how to prepare essentially countering what we see as increased hybrid threats of Russia across Europe, and also when it comes to interference in elections across the continent. So they will be discussing how to maybe address that and maybe also have a preparation to actually publish some of the evidence that they have on those hybrid attacks.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, the summit will cover a wide range of topics. However, there will be no tangible deliverables, nothing concrete necessarily coming out of it. Is the format of the EPC losing relevance then? Is its remit too broad?
The previous editions have really been rather thin on deliverables. It was more about the image as the message in many ways for the summit. But it seems that the format is a bit at the crossroads to find its exact purpose. So, as it was intended by Macron before, the very initial idea was to have something that might substitute enlargement, have a Europe of multiple speeds with the neighborhood together. That has been put aside very quickly. But from what it is in the past 2 years, I think we don't really see where the format can help to move things forward. It's very free, it's very informal. So certainly a lot of European leaders have plenty of opportunity to have bilateral meetings on the sidelines. But there are questions that maybe the frequency of the summits could be changed. I think normally now it's every 6 months, and there is a discussion whether maybe to do it only once a year to have more things to discuss and a bit more of a different setting for them as well. But as we remember, the next one is meant to be in Hungary, in Budapest in November. And there is a bit of a question whether that might come at the right time, that decision to reduce it to once a year.
And especially now that several EU member countries are considering whether to boycott diplomatic relations with Hungary, do you think there's a chance that the next summit won't take place?
That's really the key question, whether there is enough backup to change the settings now. I think the question is a bit, since this is a set summit, it will be difficult to make it not happen now. So I think what we see on the EU side is obviously an increasing push to boycott Hungarian EU presidency meetings over Prime Minister Orban's Ukraine diplomacy. But maybe for this format, there might not be enough pushback to change the date of the summit. But for now, it's taking place. For now, what we understand is going ahead. But again, in a few months, many things can change. So we will have to see.
Thank you, Alex. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.